The shot that killed Sarah Reynolds echoed long after the gun smoke cleared a sound that splintered the world into a before and an after. Before, there was the bright, cloudless sky of a Tuesday morning in Whitewater Creek. There was the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the scent of fresh bread from the bakery, and the steady, confident beat of Deputy Sheriff Ethan Reynolds' heart. He stood on the boardwalk outside his office, the silver star on his chest catching the Arizona sun, a small smile playing on his lips. In his pocket, his fingers traced the smooth, cool metal of the silver cross Sarah had given him on their wedding day. It hung on a leather cord around his neck, now a constant, comforting weight against his skin. He was waiting for her. She was 7 months along her belly, a perfect taut globe beneath her blue calico dress. And she moved with a grace that still stole his breath. They were to have lunch at the hotel, a small celebration of the life they were building, the daughter they were expecting. Ethan's smile widened. He saw her then across the dusty main street, her hand lifted in a wave, the sun turning her auburn hair to fire. Her face was radiant with a love so pure and deep, it felt like the only real thing in a world of dust and shadow. That was the before. The after began with the shattering of the plate glass window of the Whitewater Creek Bank. 3 masked men burst onto the street, guns blazing, their shouts lost in the sudden cacophony of panicked screams and panicked gunfire. They were Thornton's men. Ethan knew it instantly. He'd seen them around the Triple T Ranch, hard-faced men with a swagger born of impunity, men who moved as if the law was a suggestion they could choose to ignore. Now they were robbing the bank in broad daylight, a brazen act of contempt for the very order he was sworn to uphold. Ethan's training took over. He drew his Colt, his voice a roar that cut through the chaos. "Get down, everybody, get down." He fired a warning shot into the air, the sound sharp and authoritative. Citizens scrambled for cover, diving behind water troughs and overturning wagons. But Sarah, caught in the middle of the street, froze. Her eyes, wide with shock, locked with his across the chaotic expanse. Time seemed to slow, the world narrowing to the space between them. He saw her lips form his name, a silent plea. He started toward her, a primal need to shield her with his own body, overriding every tactical instinct. One of the robbers, a burly man with a red bandana covering his face, turned his gun, firing wildly as he backed toward his horse. It wasn't aimed. It was a spray of lead meant to sow terror and cover their escape. A single bullet, a random piece of metal propelled by chance, found its mark. Ethan saw the small puff of dust from her dress just below her heart. He saw the look of surprise on her face, a gentle questioning look, before her legs gave way. The world went silent. The robbers, their saddlebags bulging with stolen money, galloped out of town, their hoofbeats fading into a distance that no longer mattered. The citizens of Whitewater Creek slowly emerged from their hiding places, their faces pale with a horror that was a pale reflection of the abyss that had opened in Ethan's soul. He reached her in 3 desperate strides, falling to his knees in the dust beside her. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. He gathered her into his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder. A dark stain was already spreading across the blue of her dress, blossoming like a terrible flower. "Ethan." She breathed, her voice a faint whisper. Her hand, trembling and weak, came up to touch his face, then drifted down to the silver cross at his neck. Her fingers closed around it, a final, desperate grip on the symbol of the faith and love they had shared. Her eyes, those beautiful, life-filled eyes, held his for a moment longer, a universe of unspoken goodbyes passing between them. Then the light in them flickered and went out. He held her, rocking back and forth in the middle of the street, oblivious to the gathering crowd, to the gentle hand of Sheriff Holloway on his shoulder. to the world that had kept spinning after his had stopped. He held the two people he loved most in the world, his wife and his unborn daughter, and felt them both grow cold in his arms. That was the after. A world of silence, dust, and the crushing, unbearable weight of a silver cross. 3 years later, the silence remained. It had followed him from the blood-soaked street of Whitewater Creek to this isolated patch of land 40 miles from town, a place he had chosen for its emptiness. The silence had settled into the very bones of the small ranch house. He'd built a constant, oppressive presence that smothered laughter and turned words to ash. Ethan sat on the porch as the sun bled across the western mesas, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and angry orange. He was cleaning his gun, a ritual he performed every evening. The Colt Peacemaker felt heavy and familiar in his hands, its parts moving with a smooth, oiled precision. He broke it down, cleaned each component with a practiced efficiency born of years as a lawman, and then reassembled it with the same meticulous care. But when it was whole again, gleaming and deadly in the fading light, he did not strap it to his hip. He placed it in its leather holster and set it on the small table beside him, a tool without a purpose, a symbol of a life he had abandoned. The splintered sunlight on the cracked earth mirrored the fractured state of his soul. He had sought solitude here, a place where the ghosts of his past couldn't find him, but they were relentless. They lived in the silence. They lived in the face of his son. Noah stood at the edge of the corral, a small, rigid silhouette against the vast, indifferent landscape. 10 years old, but with eyes that held the ancient sorrow of a man who had seen too much. The boy had Sarah's eyes, a deep, contemplative blue that Ethan could no longer bear to meet. To look at his son was to see her, to remember the joy that had been stolen from them. And the guilt was a physical weight, a constant pressure behind his ribs. He had failed to protect her. He had failed to get justice. And in his grief, he was failing the one piece of her he had left. Noah hadn't spoken more than a handful of words in the 3 years since Sarah's death. He communicated in gestures, in the solemn set of his jaw, in the quiet, efficient way he performed his chores. He had retreated into a silence as vast and impenetrable as the desert surrounding them. "Supper's ready," Ethan called, his voice rough from disuse. Noah didn't turn, didn't acknowledge the words. He simply finished latching the corral gate and walked toward the house, his steps measured and deliberate. They ate in the oppressive quiet that had become their custom. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons against earthenware bowls and the crackle of the fire in the hearth. The house, once filled with Sarah's soft singing and Noah's childish laughter, was now a tomb. Ethan had abandoned more than his badge 3 years ago. He had abandoned his faith. The family Bible, the one Sarah had read from every evening, now gathered dust on a high shelf, its promises of comfort and salvation feeling like a bitter joke. Their life was a stagnant routine of chores and unspoken grief. They rose with the sun, tended to the few cattle and chickens they kept, mended fences, and worked the small vegetable garden. They moved around each other, like two planets locked in a sad, predictable orbit, never colliding, never connecting. This was their reality, the world they had built from the ashes of the old one. A world that was about to be irrevocably disrupted. The next morning broke clear and cold, a hard frost silvering the cracked earth. "Fence is down on the north pasture," Ethan said over a breakfast of biscuits and black coffee. "Storm must have taken out a few posts." Noah nodded, his gaze fixed on his plate. They rode out together, Ethan on his powerful chestnut gelding Thunder, and Noah on his pony Dust. The crunch of their horses' hooves on the frozen ground was the only sound in the vast, empty landscape. The mountains on the horizon stood sharp and jagged against a sky of brilliant, unforgiving blue. Ethan watched his son from the corner of his eye. The boy rode with a natural grace that was all Sarah. Another painful reminder. Another reason to look away. It was Noah who saw it first. He reined in his pony, his small body suddenly alert. "Pa," he said, his voice a quiet rasp. He pointed toward a cluster of mesquite trees near a dry wash. Ethan followed his gaze and saw it a patch of crimson, stark and shocking against the white frost. A smear of blood on the frozen ground. "Stay here," Ethan ordered, his old instincts flaring to life. He dismounted, pulling the holstered Colt from his saddlebag. He hadn't worn it in 3 years, but he never rode out without it. He followed the trail of red droplets cautiously. It led him from the open pasture into the relative shelter of the wash. The tracks were clear in the frost-covered sand. Someone had been crawling, dragging themselves toward the meager cover of the trees. As he drew closer, he heard a sound, a soft moan of pain, that was almost lost in the whisper of the wind. He rounded a large boulder and found her. A young woman curled into a tight ball against the cold earth. Her dark hair was a tangled mess, her simple dress torn and stained with blood and dirt. Even in her huddled position, he could see the unmistakable swell of her belly. She was heavily pregnant. As he knelt beside her, her eyes flew open. They were deep brown and wild with terror. She scrambled backward, one hand flying protectively to her belly, while the other fumbled at her waist, producing a small, wicked-looking knife. "Stay back," she hissed, her voice a mixture of Spanish and broken English. "No, don't take me back." Ethan raised his hands, palms open. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said slowly, keeping his voice calm and steady. "My son and I, we live nearby. We can help." Her eyes darted past him, searching for others. She was young, barely a woman, her features a beautiful mix of Mexican and Native American heritage. Her skin, though pale from cold and blood loss, was the color of warm copper. The sound of hooves made them both turn. Noah had disobeyed riding dust cautiously down into the wash. Ethan felt a flash of anger, but it was quickly replaced by surprise. Noah dismounted and approached the terrified woman, his movements slow and non-threatening. To Ethan's astonishment, the boy spoke, his voice soft but clear. "Estás a salvo." Noah said, the Spanish halting but understandable. "We help. Ayuda." The woman's eyes widened, shifting from the stern-faced man with the gun to the small, serious boy. The knife in her hand wavered. "¿Quiénes son ustedes?" she asked, her voice weak. "Who are you?" Noah looked to his father, his limited Spanish exhausted. "My name is Ethan Reynolds," Ethan said, holstering his weapon to show he meant no harm. "This is my son Noah. You're on our land. You're safe here." He saw a fresh stain of blood seeping through the fabric of her dress near her leg. "You're hurt badly. Let us help you." The woman swayed, her face contorting in a spasm of pain. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and the knife fell from her grasp as she collapsed. Ethan lunged, catching her before she hit the ground. She was lighter than he expected, fragile as a bird. As he lifted her, the torn fabric of her dress shifted, revealing a mark on her shoulder. It was a brand burned into her skin like cattle. 3 interlocking T's. The brand of the Triple T Ranch. The brand of Theodore Thornton. The world seemed to tilt for a moment. Thornton, the man whose thugs had killed his wife. The man who owned the law in Whitewater Creek. The man who had walked away from the robbery and Sarah's death without consequence. And now one of his victims, a pregnant, brutalized young woman, had collapsed on his land. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a reckoning. Pa Noah's voice was filled with a child's simple concern. "Is she going to die like Mom?" The question was a physical blow. "No," Ethan said, his voice hard with a resolve he hadn't felt in 3 years. He lifted the unconscious woman into his arms. "No, son. We won't let her." He carried her to his horse, mounted, and settled her in front of him, her head resting against his chest. As they rode toward the ranch house, the cold weight of the silver cross against his skin felt different. It was no longer just a reminder of what he had lost. It was a call to arms. He laid her on the bed in Sarah's room, a space he hadn't entered in 3 years. The air was still and stale thick with the ghosts of memory. Sarah's hairbrush on the dresser, her favorite shawl draped over a rocking chair, the scent of lavender faintly lingering in the heavy curtains. For a moment, grief threatened to paralyze him. Then Noah appeared in the doorway, his arms laden with clean cloths and a basin of warm water, his young face set with a purpose that mirrored Ethan's own. Together, they tended to the woman's injuries. As Ethan gently cleaned a deep gash on her leg, he uncovered the full extent of the brand on her shoulder. The triple T. His hands stilled. This was more than a mark of ownership. It was a declaration of Thornton's absolute power. As they worked, the woman began to stir. Her eyes fluttered open, dark pools of fear in her pale face. "You're safe," Ethan said again, his voice softer this time. "You're in our home." She stared at him, then at Noah, her breathing shallow and rapid. "My name is Sophia," she whispered, her English broken but clear. "I'm Ethan. This is Noah." He gestured to the brand, his voice low and tight. "Did Thornton do this to you?" Fear flared in her eyes again, stark and raw. She looked away, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her silence was a testament to the terror Thornton inspired. "You don't have to be afraid of him here." Ethan said the words, feeling like a vow. "Whatever you're running from, it stops at my property line." Sophia looked back at him, a flicker of something new in her gaze. Not trust, not yet, but a desperate, fragile hope. She didn't know that she had stumbled into the one place in the territory where the name Theodore Thornton was not a source of fear, but a catalyst for a long-overdue storm of vengeance. Her arrival hadn't brought trouble to his door. It had brought him a reason to fight back. For 3 days, a fragile peace settled over the ranch. Sophia slowly regained her strength, her body healing under the quiet care of Ethan and Noah. The silence in the house was different now, punctuated by Sophia's soft accented English and Noah's increasingly frequent simple questions. The boy, drawn out of his shell by a purpose greater than his own grief, became her shadow, bringing her water, reading to her from Sarah's Bible, and proudly showing her the small collection of polished rocks he kept in a box under his bed. Ethan watched the transformation in his son with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. A light had returned to Noah's eyes, a light Ethan had feared was extinguished forever. But he knew this peace was temporary. Thornton was not a man to let property, human or otherwise, go missing without a search. On the 4th day, Ethan knew he had to act. The brand on Sophia's shoulder was a constant, burning reminder of the man who had destroyed his life. He needed information. He needed to know if the law in Whitewater Creek was still bought and paid for by Thornton's money. "I'm riding into town for supplies," he told Sophia that morning. She was sitting in Sarah's rocking chair by the window, a blanket over her lap, her hands resting on the gentle swell of her belly. "We're low on flour and salt." She met his gaze, and he saw in her dark, intelligent eyes that she knew it was more than that. "Be careful, Ethan," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "His eyes are everywhere." He nodded, strapping on the colt. The weight of it on his hip felt strange, a relic from another life. But as his fingers closed around the worn wooden grip, a spark of the old Ethan, the confident deputy who had feared no man, flickered back to life. Whitewater Creek had changed little in 3 years. The bank had been rebuilt, its new window gleaming in the sun, a sterile replacement for the one that had been shattered along with his world. He saw familiar faces on the street, people who nodded in his direction with a mixture of pity and discomfort. He was a ghost to them, a living reminder of a tragedy they preferred to forget. He bypassed the general store and headed directly for the sheriff's office. Sheriff Holloway was out, but Deputy Rivera was there, a young, earnest man Ethan had known only briefly before he'd resigned. Rivera was a good man. Ethan recalled, one of the few who seemed immune to Thornton's influence. Reynolds Rivera said, his surprise genuine. "It's been a long time." "Rivera," Ethan acknowledged, closing the office door behind him. "I need to talk to you. Off the record." The deputy's expression grew cautious. He glanced toward the closed door of Holloway's office. "What kind of talk?" "Theodore Thornton," Ethan said, his voice low. Rivera's face hardened. He leaned forward, his own voice dropping to a whisper. "Whatever it is, Reynolds, be careful. Thornton owns this town more than ever. Holloway won't even take a report if it has the Triple T name on it." "I found a girl on my land," Ethan said, deciding to trust his gut. "She escaped from him. She's branded Rivera, like cattle." A muscle twitched in Rivera's jaw. "I've heard the stories. Young women, mostly Mexican or Apache, who work at the ranch and then just disappear." His eyes were filled with a frustrated anger that Ethan knew well. "We can't prove anything. Anyone who might talk is too scared, or they end up dead." "This girl, Sophia, she's pregnant," Ethan continued. "And she's not the first to suffer at his hands." Rivera looked away, a flicker of personal pain in his eyes. "I know. My own cousin worked there for a spell. She left in the middle of the night and never looked back. Won't talk about what happened even to family." He looked back at Ethan, his expression grim. "There's nothing you can do, Ethan. Not here. The law is blind when it looks at Thornton." The warning was clear, confirming Ethan's suspicions. There would be no help from the local law. He was on his own. He thanked Rivera and left the weight of his task settling heavier on his shoulders. He bought the flour and salt, maintaining the pretense of his visit, and was preparing to ride out when he saw it tacked to the notice board outside the post office. A crudely drawn poster offering a reward for information leading to the return of a runaway servant from the Triple T ranch. The description matched Sophia. Beneath it in bold letters were the words, "dangerous and unstable." Thornton was not just looking for her. He was poisoning the well, ensuring that anyone who found her would see her as a threat, not a victim. Ethan tore the poster from the board, crumpled it in his fist, and rode for home, a cold fury burning in his gut. When he returned to the ranch, he found Noah sitting on the porch steps, his small face uncharacteristically anxious. "Pa," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "Sophia's been asking about Mom." Ethan's heart tightened. What about her? She wanted to know what she was like. I told her about the stories she used to read to me, about the stars." Noah looked down at his hands. "And I told her Mom kept notebooks." Ethan froze. "What notebooks?" "In her desk," Noah said, standing up. "She wrote in them all the time, after she helped people at the clinic, said it was important to remember." Ethan had never touched Sarah's desk. It sat in a corner of the main room, a shrine he had left undisturbed. Now led by his son, he approached it as if it were a tomb. Noah opened the bottom drawer and pulled out 3 leather-bound journals. He handed them to Ethan. The pages were filled with Sarah's neat, precise script. They were not diaries. They were logs. Meticulous, detailed records of the injuries she had treated over the years. October 12th, 1878. Jose Ramirez, Triple T, broken ulna. Claims he fell from a horse. Bruising on his torso suggests otherwise. This is the third accident involving a Triple T ranch hand this month. May 5th, 1879. Maria Flores, Triple T. Severe burns on her arms. Claims a lantern exploded. The pattern is inconsistent with an explosion. Looks more like she was held down over a fire. Page after page, a litany of brutality, all traced back to the Triple T. Then Ethan found the entry that made his blood run cold. It was dated 2 weeks before her death. November 3rd, 1881. Met today with Miguel Diaz. He has also been keeping records. His focus is on the men who have disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances. We believe Thornton is systematically eliminating anyone who challenges him. Miguel's evidence combined with my medical logs might be enough. We are preparing a report for the U.S. Marshal in Tucson. The local law is too compromised. Miguel Diaz. The name was familiar. He looked up at Sophia, who had come to stand in the doorway, her face pale. My father's name was Miguel Diaz, she said softly. He stood up to Thornton when he tried to take our land. A week later, he was found dead. They called it a hunting accident. The truth hit Ethan with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a stray bullet. It wasn't a random bank robbery. The robbery had been a pretext chaos created to provide cover. Sarah hadn't been a victim of circumstance. She had been a target. She and Miguel Diaz were silenced before they could expose Thornton for the monster he was. His grief, a dull, constant ache for 3 years, sharpened into something else entirely. It became a cold, focused rage, as clear and deadly as a shard of glass. He looked from Sarah's elegant handwriting to Sophia's haunted eyes, to his son who had unknowingly held the key to this devastating truth. His mission was no longer just about protecting a desperate girl. It was about avenging his wife. It was about finishing the work she had died for. He looked at Noah, who was watching him with an unnerving perception. Pa, the boy asked, sensing the shift in the air. We're going to finish what your mother started, Ethan said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He closed the notebook. Thornton wanted a war. It's time he got one. The revelation in Sarah's notebooks transformed the quiet ranch into the headquarters of a silent war. The grief that had paralyzed Ethan for 3 years now fueled him, giving him a clarity and purpose he hadn't felt since he'd worn a badge. He spent the next day preparing not for a fight, but for a journey. Their only hope lay with the U.S. Marshal in Tucson, far from Thornton's sphere of influence. They would take the evidence, Sarah's journals, Sophia's testimony, and see that justice was finally served. But Thornton was not a man to wait patiently. As dusk settled on the second day after Ethan's trip to town and the attack came, it wasn't a direct assault. It was something more insidious, more characteristic of Thornton's cruelty. It began with the smell of smoke. Ethan was in the barn, checking the horses, when the acrid scent hit his nostrils. He stepped outside and saw it. Flames were licking up the dry wooden walls of the barn, smoke billowing into the twilight sky. It was the barn he and Sarah had raised together, beam by beam. Another piece of their life turning to ash. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. Noah, Sophia. He roared, his first thought for their safety. He saw Noah running from the house, his small face a mask of terror. Pa, the barn's on fire. Where's Sophia? Ethan yelled, grabbing a bucket. Inside, as she saw them, 2 men on horseback. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. It was a diversion. He sprinted back toward the house, his mind racing. They set the fire to draw him out, to leave the house unprotected. He burst through the door, his Colt in his hand. The main room was empty, a chair overturned. Sophia. a muffled sound came from the bedroom. He kicked the door open and found her on the floor struggling against a burly man who was trying to tie a gag around her mouth. It was one of Thornton's men, one of the bank robbers from that terrible day. Ethan recognized the cruel set of his eyes above the bandana he now wore. The man looked up startled. He released Sophia and drew his own pistol, but Ethan was faster. He fired once, the shot deafening in the small room. The man crumpled to the floor, a look of surprise on his face. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed Sophia, who was trembling but unharmed, and pulled her toward the main room just as a second man appeared in the doorway, his gun raised. Noah, who had followed his father inside, acted on pure instinct. He grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the hearth and swung it with all his might, catching the second man squarely in the back of the knee. The man roared in pain and surprise, his shot going wide, shattering a window. The momentary distraction was all Ethan needed. He shoved Sophia and Noah behind him and returned fire. The second man staggered back out the door and disappeared into the growing darkness. Outside the barn was now fully engulfed, the roar of the flames, a terrible counterpoint to the sudden silence. The hay and dry timber burned with a terrifying speed, casting a hellish dancing light across the yard. Ethan stood on the porch, his arm protectively around Noah, while Sophia watched from the doorway, her hand on her belly. They had won the skirmish, but the message was clear. They were not safe here. Thornton knew about Sophia, and he would stop at nothing to get her back and to silence Ethan for good. "He won't stop," Sophia whispered, her voice trembling. "He'll send more men. Then we won't be here when they arrive." Ethan said, his voice hard as iron. He looked at the burning barn, at the destruction of his past, and felt no grief, only a cold, clarifying anger. Thornton had made this personal. Now the final confrontation would be on Ethan's terms. "We're not running to Tucson. Not yet. First, we end this. I'm going to draw him out." His plan was audacious, born of desperation and a deep, intimate knowledge of his enemy's psyche. Thornton was a man driven by control and legacy. He believed Sophia's child was his grandchild, the last of his line. He would come for the child himself. But he was also a man haunted by his past, a fact Ethan was only just beginning to understand. "We're going back to Whitewater Creek," Ethan announced. Noah and Sophia stared at him. "But Pa, that's where his power is greatest," Noah protested. "It's also the site of his greatest crimes," Ethan countered. "And my greatest loss. There's a poetry to it that a man like Thornton won't be able to resist." He looked at them, his eyes burning with an intensity they had never seen before. "He won't expect us to run toward the fire. We'll be waiting for him. Not at the sheriff's office, not at the hotel. We'll wait for him at the bank." They rode under the cover of darkness, the glow from their burning barn, a funeral pyre in the rear view. They skirted the main road, using the old prospector trails that Ethan knew from his days as a deputy. He left a false trail leading south toward the Mexican border, a simple deception that might buy them a day. They arrived in Whitewater Creek just before dawn, a ghost town in the gray light. Ethan led them not to the new bank, but to the old one. The building had been left standing after the robbery, a boarded-up monument to the day the town's sense of security had died. Its windows were dark, vacant eyes, staring out onto the street where Sarah had fallen. He settled Sophia and Noah in the abandoned assayer's office next door, a dusty, forgotten space with a clear view of the bank's entrance. He gave Noah one of the journals. "If something happens to me," he said, his voice low and urgent, "you get this to Rivera. You trust him and him alone. Understand?" Noah nodded, his small face pale but resolute. He was no longer just a boy. He was a soldier in his mother's war. Ethan then did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He walked into the telegraph office and sent a single unsigned message to the Triple T Ranch. I have your heir. Come alone to the Whitewater Creek Bank at noon if you want to see him born. Come armed, and the mother dies with him. It was a gamble, a direct challenge to Thornton's arrogance and obsession. Ethan was counting on the fact that Thornton would not trust his men with something so important. He would believe only he could handle the situation, and he would not risk the life of his supposed grandchild. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows down the empty street, Ethan took up his position inside the darkened bank. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the boarded-up windows. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and decay. He stood on the exact spot where the robbers had fired their guns, the place from which the bullet that killed Sarah had been launched. He was turning the site of his greatest trauma into his weapon. At precisely noon, a lone rider appeared at the end of the street. Theodore Thornton, tall and imposing on his black stallion, looked less like a rancher and more like a king surveying his domain. He dismounted his movements, deliberate and confident, and walked toward the bank. He was alone, just as Ethan had gambled. The door creaked open as Thornton pushed his way inside. His eyes took a moment to adjust to the gloom. He saw Ethan standing in the center of the room, his Colt aimed steadily at Thornton's chest. Reynolds, Thornton said, his voice calm, almost conversational. I should have known you didn't have it in you to simply run. You always did have a flair for the dramatic. This isn't drama, Thornton, Ethan said, his voice unnervingly quiet. This is a reckoning. Where is the girl? Thornton demanded, his eyes scanning the shadows. And the child. They're safe, for now. Thornton's lip curled into a sneer. You think you can win this, you a broken-down ex-lawman with nothing to his name? I own this territory. I own the law. I will take my grandchild, and I will see you hang for murder and kidnapping. The child isn't yours, Ethan said flatly. And you're not here for a grandchild. You're here because you couldn't stand the thought of losing something you believe you own. A flicker of something surprise, perhaps even a sliver of respect, crossed Thornton's face. You understand me better than I thought, Reynolds. But you're wrong about the child. He carries my blood. He is the future of my name. A name built on murder and fear, Ethan shot back. Sarah knew. Her and Miguel Diaz. You had them killed because they were going to expose you. Thornton actually laughed, a cold, humorless sound that echoed in the cavernous room. Your wife. She was an unfortunate complication. Collateral damage. I didn't care about her. My quarrel was never with her. His eyes pale and cold as a winter sky locked onto Ethan's. It was always with you. Ethan frowned, confused. Me, I was just a deputy. You were more than that, Thornton hissed, his composure finally cracking, revealing the raw, festering wound beneath. You were the law, the symbol of the very thing that failed me. He took a step forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. 20 years ago, before I built my empire, I had a family. A wife, a son. They were everything to me. We had a small homestead not far from here. Apache raiders came one night. They burned it all. They butchered them, Reynolds. My boy was 5 years old. The story was the stuff of frontier legend, but hearing it from the man himself, seeing the genuine agony that twisted his features, was jarring. There was a cavalry outpost nearby. Thornton continued, his voice thick with a decades-old rage. They were supposed to protect the settlers, but they were too slow. The commanding officer of that patrol, a fresh-faced lieutenant full of regulations and excuses. That was you, wasn't it, Reynolds? Ethan's mind reeled. He remembered the incident, a small bloody skirmish. He had been a young officer, then just a boy himself following orders. He hadn't made the connection. "You failed in your duty," Thornton snarled, all pretense of civility gone. "You let my family die. So I decided, if the law wouldn't protect what was mine, I would become my own law. I built an empire to control this land, to make sure nothing like that could ever happen again. I own it all so I can protect it all." His gaze was wild, unhinged. "The bank robbery. It wasn't about the money. It was about tearing down this town, this symbol of the pathetic justice you represent. Your wife just happened to get in the way." He smiled, a terrible, broken thing. "If you had done your job, then she would be alive today. Her death is on your hands as much as mine." The revelation was staggering. This wasn't a battle against a greedy villain. It was a tragic, twisted confrontation between two men shattered by loss, two men whose pasts were inextricably and horribly linked. For a moment, Ethan's resolve wavered. He saw in Thornton's madness a dark mirror of his own grief. Then he thought of Sarah's smile. He thought of Noah's silence. He thought of Sophia's brand. "You used your pain as an excuse to inflict it on others." Ethan said, his voice steady again, his aim unwavering. "My wife died trying to stop you. I'm going to finish what she started." At that moment, the back door of the bank swung open. Deputy Rivera stood there, his own gun drawn. He wasn't there to save Ethan. He was there to make a stand. "It's over, Thornton Rivera," said his voice ringing with the authority that Sheriff Holloway had abdicated. "You're under arrest." Thornton stared from Ethan to Rivera, trapped. His face contorted into a mask of pure fury. With a guttural roar, he lunged not at Rivera, but at Ethan. He was a man with nothing left to lose, choosing to go down fighting the ghost that had haunted him for 20 years. The two men crashed to the floor. The gun flew from Ethan's hand. They were no longer lawman and outlaw, but two grieving fathers locked in a desperate primal struggle. Thornton was bigger, stronger, his hands closing around Ethan's throat, his thumbs pressing down his face, a mask of insane rage. As Ethan's vision began to tunnel, his hands scrabbled on the dusty floor, his fingers closing around a loose floorboard. With the last of his strength, he brought it up, cracking it against the side of Thornton's head. The big man grunted, his grip loosening for just a second. It was enough. Ethan twisted, throwing Thornton off him. He scrambled for his gun as Thornton rose, blood streaming from his temple. Thornton charged again, a wounded bull. Ethan fired. The shot was deafening, the bullet hitting Thornton square in the chest. The big man stopped, a look of profound surprise on his face. He looked down at the blossoming red stain on his shirt, then back up at Ethan. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but only a gurgle of blood came out. Then Theodore Thornton, the king of the territory, crumpled to the floor of the bank, his empire of pain and vengeance dying with him. Silence descended on the dusty room, broken only by Ethan's ragged breaths. Rivera slowly lowered his pistol, his face grim. Outside, the sounds of the town slowly returning to life could be heard, drawn by the gunshots. Justice, in its own brutal, bloody way, had finally come to Whitewater Creek. Ethan looked down at the man who had caused him so much pain and felt not triumph, but a vast, hollow emptiness. The reckoning was over. Now the healing had to begin. The dust settled in the old bank, and with it, the empire of Theodore Thornton crumbled. Deputy Rivera, his face a mask of grim determination, took charge. He didn't arrest Ethan. He took his statement along with Sarah's notebooks and the list compiled by Miguel Diaz. The evidence was overwhelming. By the time the U.S. Marshal arrived from Tucson, the story of Thornton's long reign of terror was not just rumor, but documented fact. His men were rounded up, his paid-off officials exposed, and a fragile, uncertain semblance of true law began to return to Whitewater Creek. Ethan walked out of the bank into the harsh sunlight, leaving the bodies and the ghosts behind. Noah and Sophia were waiting for him, their faces etched with worry. Noah ran to him, his arms wrapping around Ethan's waist in a fierce, desperate hug. It was the first time his son had willingly touched him in 3 years. Ethan held him tight, burying his face in the boy's hair, a dam of grief finally breaking inside him. A few days later, after the marshals had departed and a semblance of calm had returned, Ethan stood once more before Sarah's grave on the cemetery hillside. The November wind was cold, but it felt clean, as if it were sweeping away the last 3 years of dust and decay. He placed a single white rose on the granite headstone. "It's over, Sarah," he whispered, his voice no longer rough, with unshed tears, but clear and steady. "He's gone, the man who took you from us. He can't hurt anyone ever again." He paused the words he needed to say, forming slowly, painfully. "I'm sorry. Not for your death. I know now there was nothing I could have done to stop that. I'm sorry for the years I let the grief take me from Noah. I hid from him because he has your eyes, and it hurt too much to look at him. I let him grow up in a silent house because I was afraid of the noise, afraid of living without you." He reached up and touched the silver cross at his neck. "I was lost. But I think I'm starting to find my way back." He stayed there for a long time, not mourning what was, but quietly contemplating what could be. When he finally walked away, he felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from his soul. Back at the ranch, he found Noah and Sophia packing their few belongings into saddlebags. The decision had been made without words. The ranch, the house he had built with Sarah, was saturated with too many ghosts. It was a place of endings, and they needed a new beginning. "The law will be different now in Whitewater Creek," Sophia said, her gaze steady. "Deputy Rivera will be the new sheriff. They will need good men like you, Ethan." Ethan shook his head. He looked at Noah, who was carefully wrapping a small framed portrait of Sarah in a blanket. "I was a lawman once. Now I'm a father. That's the only title I need." His purpose was clear now, no longer a quest for vengeance, but a quiet, determined mission to build a family from the broken pieces of their lives. They were ready to leave. The sun was setting, casting long, peaceful shadows across the land. Sophia stood on the porch, holding her newborn daughter, who had arrived safely in the world 2 weeks after Thornton's death, a tiny, perfect symbol of life's persistence. Ethan walked over to them. He looked down at the infant, so small and fragile, yet so full of promise. "Have you thought of a name?" he asked gently. Sophia smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that transformed her face. "I have. I want to name her Sarah." The name hung in the air, a perfect, beautiful tribute. Ethan felt a fresh wave of emotion, not of sadness, but of profound gratitude. He reached up and unclasped the leather cord from around his neck. He took the small silver cross, the one Sarah's fingers had last touched, the one that had been a weight of grief for so long, and gently placed the cord around the baby's neck. The tiny silver cross rested on the swaddling clothes, gleaming in the last light of the day. It was not an ending. It was a legacy of hope and strength being passed on. They mounted their horses, a small, unconventional family, ready to face an unknown future. Ethan on Thunder, Noah on Dust, and Sophia, with baby Sarah secure in a cradle board on a gentle mare. They didn't look back at the small ranch house. Their eyes were on the west, on the vast, open country that stretched toward the setting sun, a land of promise and new beginnings. They were not running from the past. but riding toward a future they would build together, a journey not of revenge, but of redemption connection, the quiet, resilient power of hope.